Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss Trump's Big Beautiful Bill, Joe Biden's health, and the South African Refugee Resettlement Program. I'm joined by Ashley Frawley and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So Trump is negotiating with congressional Republicans, trying to get effectively a single bill through that will define this second term of his. It's meant to deliver on several of his campaign promises, like no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security benefits. But it's also blowing through any limits on spending, increasing the deficit, and raising concerns about cuts to healthcare for poor and working class Americans. Jeff, Ashley, what have you made of the debate over Trump's marvelous bill in his telling?
Well, it just seems to be, and this will be a theme I will repeat in relation to the Democrats when we talk about Biden, but it's a good place to look at the contradictions of a political coalition and the points at which it has difficulty holding together. So something that we had actually planned coverage of, but then it was seemingly, has been taken out of the equation, was the prospect of a tax on millionaires, right? That this would be part of this bill, that there would actually be an increase on higher earners, and that this is a proposal that goes back a ways. I think Steve Bannon, his sort of faction of MAGA, has supported it as a way of not just bringing in revenue, but also signaling something about the more working class nature of the party coalition. So clearly, the other elements that point to that are the promising no tax on tips or Social Security, and in those cases, I think you again have an attempt to signal something about the nature of the coalition. It's worth recalling that this no tax on tips idea was actually cribbed by the Harris campaign during the campaign last year. So clearly, even though no Democrat had thought of it, once it was proposed, it became something they couldn't really resist picking up themselves. So, I think the basic problem here is that there's been a broad reluctance in American politics to figure out how to raise revenue. And that means, and it's just an interesting fact that, being a fiscal conservative in the United States seems to be unlike any other country in that it does not involve wanting to increase revenue. It only involves wanting to cut spending. Whereas in general, fiscal conservatives in most other countries would seek to do both, and would at least have some positive proposals as to how to increase revenue. So, it seems that there's an attempt to use this bill to kind of have it both ways. In other words, to signal this openness to new parts of the coalition that Trump has brought in, to this more kind of populist orientation, this greater orientation towards downscale voters, lower income voters, but at the same time to not signal a significant break with decades of GOP anti-tax sentiment. And if there had been an attempt to include, and there had been an insistence on an attempt to include the millionaire tax, then that would have been, I would argue, a more kind of serious attempt to articulate that reorientation. But instead, I think there's sort of an attempt to have it both ways, which is to to keep the GOP caucus in the House of Representatives in particular happy by sticking to the kind of Grover Norquist no new tax pledge, while also offering some goodies to these newer groups of voters who have been brought into the coalition. And the result of this is simply going to be that and then the final point, the final sticking point, which relates to spending rather than revenues, is Medicaid cuts, which again the GOP caucus in Congress would like to pursue aggressively, and which Trump, I believe, in a meeting with congressional GOP leaders yesterday, sort of said was a non-starter, right? And then there's sort of an attempt to get around this by saying, oh, well, we just want to cut waste and fraud in Medicaid. And so it's kind of this cribbing of this Doge language where, instead of sort of straight up saying you need to cut back, the government saying, oh, we're just going to cut the waste and fraud. In other words, it's not going to, we're going to cut it, but it's not going to actually affect the provision of services through Medicaid. And again, it just seems like the way these contradictions are, and it brings me back to a piece Christopher Caldwell wrote for Compact shortly after its founding about inflation under Biden, right? And in which he argued that, I believe it was called Inflation is a Choice. And, essentially the point was that the nature of the Democratic coalition sort of required policies that would be inflationary, because it required keeping a number of disparate groups together by keeping them happy. And so I think something similar is happening here. And the thing that seems notable is just the unwillingness or lack of deep commitment that would be necessary to really bring about an actual significant policy realignment, which I think would have been signaled or would be signaled in a meaningful way by this proposed millionaire tax, which again has apparently been discarded now because of the objections of the House of GOP congressmen. And so if that had happened, I think we could say there's something really significant going on here. Instead, I think what we have is an attempt to kind of keep the band together by keeping everybody happy. And the result of that is going to be, deficit exploding and also possibly inflationary. We shall see.
Yeah, so you bring up inflation, and that's something that's probably looming enormously on the horizon. But at the same time, government. I've been listening to the to Prime Minister's questions in the UK today as well, and it's just a very common thing for oppositions to be like, oh, but inflation is up by this much, or if it's down, look, we've got inflation down. This is like a worldwide thing. But anyways, yeah, I mean, not that governments can't do anything about it, but there's an enormous crisis probably looming. So we'll cover this in Compact, but I've been worried about this for a while, and none of these proposals will do anything to help that situation. But yeah, I mean, I agree with what you're saying, that it's clearly like a lot of ideological wash in terms of like no tax on tips is, that gets you on the, we're on the side of the working class and the low paid, at the same time as cutting Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act, food assistance programs. But no, we're actually just cutting the waste and the fraud. And Trump kept repeating the same three things over and over and over again. And I can't remember what the third one was. So apparently it wasn't the most effective messaging. But he just kept saying, no, we're just cutting the waste and the fraud, cutting the waste and the fraud. So it seems to be like having it both ways is what every government is trying to do, which is kind of interesting because we're told that there's this enormous polarization, that that the real problem with politics at the moment is that we're very polarized. But every single government seems to be trying to walk this line of pleasing everybody. And I mean, nobody seems pleased, but at the same time, it does seem to keep order. So in the UK, sorry that I keep sort of pivoting to the UK, but it's the area that I know best. You have the current government sort of talking tough on immigration at the same time as trying to bring in policies that are, very sort of run of the mill, neoliberal, technocratic kind of garbage. And then sort of while nobody's looking, bringing in essentially free movement again under the guise of an Erasmus scheme. So it's just interesting that every single government, and even Trump, this sort of like the symbol of the one end of the hard right, is sort of trying to walk this line as well, trying to please everybody. But the other thing that I noticed too in the rhetoric was, and just generally that moves through Trump's entire sort of persona, is this idea that's just common sense. And really, if we could just cut through all this red tape, get everything done that we want in one big, beautiful bill, then we would be able to solve all these problems. Really, all these problems are really, really easy to solve. But the problem is that there's too much political red tape. And we're about to find out that that is not the case, that society is extraordinarily complex. Extraordinarily complex. And when you try to do something in one area, you inevitably screw up 1,000 things in another area. And the problem was never too much red tape and we just can't do things fast enough, quickly enough, move quickly and break things. The problem is that society is just really, really damn hard to control. I sound like a libertarian here, but that's probably a good thing. Like it's not only that a man at the top shouldn't try to govern all on his own, it's that he can't. And if you try, you're going to screw up a lot of things.
Another thing that strikes me in looking at all this, in addition to the points Geoff and Ashley have raised, is just the way in which Congress no longer really seems capable of functioning. I mean, you get the occasional oversight hearing that produces headlines and has an effect on our nation's politics. I think in particular of the anti-Semitism hearings that led to several Ivy League presidents losing their jobs. But in terms of actual lawmaking, very little of it seems to go on. I'm sure Congress gets together and passes resolutions for naming post offices in honor of local dignitaries and such things. But really, it seems that the GOP, which has control of all the branches of government, is really only committed to passing one significant bill this year, and so all of these kind of topics that are distinct and could be treated separately are mushed into one bill. You have someone like Congressman Don Bacon from my native Nebraska. He's holding out because he wants more funding for federal refugee resettlement, a topic we'll get into later in the podcast. You have Republican congressmen from the state I now live in, New York, holding out for more favorable state and local tax deductions. You have people talking about restructuring Medicaid, bringing in more stringent work requirements or removing illegal immigrants from its rolls, on and on and on. And you can package all of this into one bill and make it all one, fierce negotiation. But it seems that Congress has just ceased to function as it is really supposed to. Things are increasingly outsourced to the executive branch. So when you have Trump coming to Capitol Hill and saying to the House GOP, assembled in a closed door meeting, saying, "Don't f around with Medicaid." He didn't say f, of course. He spelled that one out. It's notable not just because he's warning them against a kind of more hardline conservative fiscal hawkish position. It's notable because you have a president going to Capitol Hill and ordering around congressmen, which would be perceived under the original and traditional understanding of our system to be an inappropriate um, kind of imposition on what ought to be an independent branch. So we have lots of evidence here of just kind of a breakdown in the American system, and uh, that just makes it very unwieldy because you have all of these people who still retain a kind of formal role, but they aren't exercising those muscles regularly, and they're trying to accomplish uh, something that they really have no skill at doing, which is bargaining, negotiating, pushing bills through. This isn't really their job. It's not that in the sense that they don't really do this normally. They all seem to perceive their job to be something else. For many of them, it's just employing the bully pulpit. It's being influencers. They have podcasts. They have TikToks. Ted Cruz has a very popular podcast. AOC is big on social media. Um, Ben Sass, when he was in Congress, was writing all kinds of books. Um, so, other congressman Mike Lee is on Twitter all the time as Based Mike Lee. He's constantly tweeting, great point, Pozo, on and on. So what is the job of these people? They seem to feel that their job is, basically to compete with the media, to be the media. And that's one reason they don't seem to be very good at legislating. Now we turn to former President Biden's health, which is even worse than Ashley's health. Ashley is sick today, but still joining us on the podcast. Thank you, Ashley. Biden has been diagnosed with prostate cancer. There's a great deal of controversy about that, about when the diagnosis occurred. Was this known during his presidency? Was there a certain culpability on Biden's part or on the part of his medical advisors? If that wasn't known, should they have been testing him, especially given that he was running for office in 2024? And of course, we have the book Original Sin Out by Jake Tapper of CNN and Alex Thompson of Axios, documenting Biden's decline, something that Tapper denied during the campaign, but now is offering the authoritative account of. What do you guys think? Is Biden our former president, or was he never really president at all, as some are now suggesting?
The whole situation is very fascinating. The way I would think about it again is sort of coalitional in part. He sort of needed to serve a particular function in holding together the coalition. And so, given that necessity, all of these things kind of had to be denied or swept under the rug. And I don't know. I mean, I found myself thinking about the film, the great film, The Death of Stalin. And, part of this is because what was going on with Biden, as I, maybe have said on this podcast before, but repeatedly thought through throughout his term, and increasingly towards the end, it was reminiscent of these stories I remember hearing about, like, what happened in these sort of one-party dictatorships where, when the great leader dies, it's like so awkward and complicated to figure out how to proceed from there that sometimes they just cover up the fact of his death. I believe this is, Franco is one example. I believe Kim Il-sung is another example. And so, there's this problem of, like, how do you proceed once the great leader is gone? And this is partly like when the sort of orientation of the state is so much around one person. And by the way, I think we can imagine that this is going to be an extremely interesting thing when Donald Trump passes away, or becomes incapacitated in some form. That will be a very interesting thing to observe. So what's weird about the Biden case is that on some level, Biden was never, a particularly dominant figure, sort of either ideologically or personality wise. Instead, he served as a kind of useful placeholder. So you could have this sort of effect that you have with these cult of personality, sort of one-party state dictators, where the function of the leader as the kind of, quilting point of all of these different kind of coalitional agendas and incentives, could still be fulfilled, even though I think on some level Biden was never anybody's favorite. He was never somebody who, he was remembered for some strong debate performances and sort of aggressive speeches here and there, but he was never somebody's idea of some kind of great charismatic figure, right? And his secondary status to Obama was important in this regard, right? So when he was the vice president, there was some sense in which he served a certain function as a kind of reassuring figure with who had a sort of veteran status in the Senate, and who could also kind of embody through his identity characteristics and his personality this older democratic spirit, right? The sort of Rust Belt, his Pennsylvania roots and his sort of Rust Belt, his ability to channel a certain rhetoric of the old Democratic Party, even though, his actual sort of legislative career, he wasn't exactly a strong sort of old labor Democratic, precisely. He was, somewhat on the kind of Clintonian triangulating neoliberal end of things. But he served kind of symbolically a function of embodying a kind of useful counterpoint to Obama's coalition of the ascendant sort of symbolic significance, right? That Biden could kind of show the continued presence of this older version of the Democratic Party, which we'd associate with, small town Pennsylvania and this kind of more downscale white Rust Belt sort of quality. And so he served that function then. And then when he comes in as president, he really is, or when he comes in as the nominee in 2020, he's clearly put in there again to solve this problem, which is basically that you have this conflict within the party between the sort of Obama, Clinton, upscale professional. You could argue in a sense between two parts of the Democrats' new coalition, one of which was kind of the Obama, Clinton, upscale professional part of it, and then the other part of which was this kind of younger, more angry, whether sort of Sandersite, sort of class-driven, whatever democratic social, sort of DSA contingent, or more sort of identity, racial and identity driven part of the coalition. So you have this conflict that played out in the 2020 primaries. And Biden was kind of stuck in as somebody who, again, could kind of bring together, wasn't somebody who would negatively polarize any part of the coalition. And so he had that kind of ability to keep things stitched together. And so, I think what's important here is that the party after, and this is, to me, the most significant thing is, clearly both parties were, for various reasons, in crisis after the 2008 financial crisis. Both of them had major internal fractures. Donald Trump was able to come in and sort of enact this hostile takeover through the primary process and sort of displace the party grandees. Sanders attempted something similar, but was fended off twice, and then kind of he quite actively sort of surrendered and put his weight behind the party establishment that he had previously opposed. And the important thing for the Democratic Party after 2008 was just to avoid genuine sort of primary contestation or to delegitimize it where possible. And Biden, again, kind of served this function. to kind of keep the, he neither was beloved enough nor hated enough by anybody to perpetuate, or by being neither beloved nor hated by anybody, he could kind of fend off the crisis that the party faced in terms of its internal rifts. And so that was why, as I see it, there was this need to, again, similar to with these kind of one-party dictatorships, like this need to keep his declining capacities taboo or hidden, in order to avoid this final reckoning with the crises internal to the party. And so, I think Death of Stalin, I thought of this just because it's a good example of how, as soon as the great leader dies, all of these kind of factions start sniping at each other and going for each other's throats and trying to displace each other. And, I think you could argue that what Biden did was, and it's sort of been successful, but we'll see what happens in 2028. But he just was able to serve this placeholder function and delay the conflict coming to a head in a way that would actually bring about some genuine radical reconfiguration of the party. And so he ultimately held it out long enough, and the various people involved in kind of covering up and making excuses for him did their job long enough that they kind of put off any such process until it was kind of too late. And now having Trump in office again just means that the party can kind of reunite in opposition to Trump. And so it's all kind of worked. Like it's worked at fending off the crisis. But the result, I think, is that the party is deeply unhealthy and is in a very bad place because it refuses to reckon with these internal rifts or confront or acknowledge them.
Forgive me if you've covered this, but why, if they were aware of his declining cognitive capacity and even potentially that he had cancer, because that's the speculation, why were they so keen to run him then? Like, then, things worked out in the end for them. But why, if they thought that, surely they must have known it would have been a disaster and he could potentially die in office?
I think because the alternative is actually worse from the perspective of the people trying to kind of keep the current version of the party intact, which is a sort of genuine process of contestation, as well as an acknowledgement of how far things had already gone, would have been, in their view, more destructive, to what they want the party to be than acknowledging reality is how I would interpret it.
Maybe in a way they hoped for that outcome because perhaps they thought that their preferred candidate had no chance at office unless she got there by default. That's just my conspiratorial senses.
Yeah, I don't really, it's again, I think you have to sort of think of it less as a sort of conscious. I would say, even though there obviously is a kind of conspiratorial dimension to this, like, I think you have to really kind of psychoanalyze it and see it as a process of kind of denial and displacement and deferral. Like that, there's just this deep imperative to defer and delay any confrontation with the reality of this internal crisis within the party, because doing so would radically and sort of existentially challenge the status of all the people involved in making these decisions. So,
yeah,
in other words,
absolutely.
I don't
well
think it's a
shrugging their
sort of
shoulders as opposed to like actively conspiring. It's more like, oh well, if that happens, then it won't be the end of the world.
and I think you have to sort of see it as this is sort of happening unconsciously on some level. Like it's a logic of sort of institutional self-preservation that plays itself out again and just in these forms of just denial and refusal to confront sort of elephants in the room and so on.
Yeah, I want to look back at article that we published at the end of Biden's term by Nathan Pinkoski titled "The Biden Administration Did Not Take Place." He draws on Jean Baudrillard, one of the French theorists who makes frequent appearances in our pages, to argue that there was a kind of simulacrum of a presidential administration, but the reality was quite different. The executive branch, unlike the other branches, is led by a single figure because, in the mind of the founders, certain executive functions need to have an element of speed and decision that can only come by having a single person capable of making decisions. To have a country led by a committee in the face of a foreign policy crisis or some significant domestic upheaval would tend toward paralysis and indecision and breakdown. So there's a notion that you need an actual person at the head of this branch, and that just isn't the case with Congress. It isn't the case with the Supreme Court. They're not led by a single person. Lyndon Johnson may have been master of the Senate, but the idea is that the Senate is a consultative body representing multiple interests and not a body in which one man is seen as a kind of vessel of the nation capable of making decisions for the nation at large. And just as we've been talking about the breakdown of the classic conception of Congress, Penkovsky sees in the Biden administration a breakdown of this classic conception of the presidency. If Biden wasn't capable of acting decisively, if he was seriously managed, if many of his decisions were signed by auto pen, for some reason he's not actually signing the executive orders he's making. He's making much more liberal use of this auto pen, this mechanical signature device, than any of his predecessors. It tends to suggest that the country was led, by a more consultative process, by, members of his staff, well informed, public spirited, very knowledgeable and committed people who believe that they understood Biden's priorities and were representing his wishes, no doubt. But nonetheless, not really a president. And it's if that is the case, I guess it's interesting because we showed that this can be done. You kind of operate with a figurehead for 4 years. You can muddle through. I don't know that it was our greatest 4 years, but apparently you can kind of make it through. But I wonder if the two phenomena aren't related in some way, if the inability of Congress to serve as an effective forum for negotiating and managing differences between these coalitions, through whatever the regular passage of bills that, have pork barrel spending or satisfying certain ideological needs, whatever. I wonder if that lack of a kind of consultative, pluralistic political process in Congress kind of creates a need for something kind of like that within the presidential administration, where functions that might seem to be legislative are increasingly clustered.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And, I would say it seems noteworthy that I would argue, from the perspective of, being interested in various kinds of realignment, political economy, in terms of revitalizing manufacturing and, reconfiguring supply chains to make the U.S. less vulnerable to disruptions. You can argue that the most significant aspect of Bidenomics was his adoption of this agenda from the first Trump administration, and we have published things that argue this more or less. And I think you can also argue that in some sense, despite all of these deficits, and perhaps because of the relative merits of some of the people in Biden's stat, some of the people he appointed, that we actually had a more kind of competently executed version of that than we've seen under Trump. And one that actually did proceed through Congress with legislation like the CHIPS Act. And so, I think you can sort of say the first 2 years of Biden, you had you had Democratic control of Congress and the White House, and basically they did, despite all these problems, they did actually produce some legislation that had some value and should be acknowledged as such by and did actually gain bipartisan buy-in on some of this reindustrialization stuff. So it just seems kind of noteworthy that when people talk about, and I mean, it's been very bizarre to see some people who weren't particularly interested in any of this economic stuff a couple years ago suddenly who are all in on the tariffs and the idea of reshoring and so on, but like have no interest in this whole history. But the point that strikes me now is that you can sort of argue, well, we have an energetic executive that there's no question he's energetic and has a sort of will to pursue a very specific agenda. But what we don't see him doing, and I'm talking about Trump now, is actually assembling or attempting to assemble coalitions for the policies that he wants to enact in a way that despite his many deficits, Biden was able to do, at least in the first 2 years of his presidency. What we have now is a sort of executive who seems more interested in just kind of strong arming his agenda through by whatever means necessary. So I don't know. I mean, it's just striking to me like that there's what we now have is an executive who's capable of, unlike Biden, of kind of single-mindedly pursuing an agenda, but doesn't seem to want to or have the interest in doing so through the traditional means, by which I would mean, if you're going to massively reconfigure the economy, wouldn't you want to assemble, when you have not only in your own party, but members of Congress like, Democrat Jared Golden from Maine, who actually, has a bill that would legislate the 10% universal tariff. So in other words, you have people who want to actually work on this stuff, not even just from your own party. And yet there seems to be no will to actually pursue any of these things legislatively from this administration, nor to build up a sort of coalition, a sort of coherent coalitional narrative around things like tariffs. So even the people who are involved in thinking in the realm of think tanks and so on about this type of stuff seem to be completely blindsided by what happened on April 2nd. So it's a very bizarre situation where you have this kind of empty vessel placeholder president in 2020 to 22 who nonetheless was able to kind of achieve certain things through somewhat traditional presidential means. And now you have a president who seems to have the will, the energy, and the vision to pursue a very particular agenda single-mindedly, but seems to be struggling just to kind of extend some tax cuts through Congress. So it's a very odd disconnect.
Last week, 59 white South Africans, largely descended from Dutch settlers, arrived in the United States under a refugee resettlement program. Trump has spoken of the genocide in the country taking place, genocide, his word, against white farmers. It's drawn a lot of opposition here in the U.S. As we record, Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, is meeting with Donald Trump in the White House. what do you all make of it?
Everybody wants to be victims. Everybody wants to be victims of genocide. It's the only way to it's the only way to wield power. This is a victim power. I wrote about it in the context of René Girard a couple of years ago, and this is the latest version of it. You need to have a kind of totem victim who you can wield as proof of your victim status, and that's how you seem to wield power today. So this is, it seems very notable. Now, I will say one thing in favor of this move, which is to say that there has been a deep kind of confusion about this whole category of refugees, and this has had, extremely profound effects on the country, on the immigration system, which is basically that almost all immigration comes through asylum claim, people claiming asylum. And this category has become blurred to the extent that, it seems very unclear. And those who kind of defend the status quo immigration system or the way it proceeded under Biden just seem to have no answer to who they would actually consider an illegitimate asylum claim. Like it's unclear to me that the people who defend this have any category of person they would not consider a legitimate asylum claimant, except maybe these sort of Afrikaners. And so I suppose it's kind of useful to have a group who you can actually get the other side to say does not have a legitimate asylum claim. I don't think this will actually lead anywhere good or coherent, but it is worth being able to identify a group who does not have, according to these people, do not have a legitimate asylum claim, because then the question would be, okay, well, who else would not have a legitimate asylum claim?
Right.
No,
So Jeff, the Episcopal Church's refugee resettlement arm has refused to resettle these Afrikaners after being informed by the federal government that it was expected to do so under the terms of its federal grant. And connected with this unwillingness to resettle these South Africans, the Episcopal Church has announced that it will be ceasing to cooperate with the federal government's refugee resettlement more generally, and will stop receiving grants for resettlement at the end of this year. So this does seem to have been kind of a poison pill for certain people. There's maybe kind of hints of the USAID thing where the Trump administration is finding ways to really cut against the existing logic of all of these NGOs, all of these programs that receive federal funding. It's finding a way to kind of bring them to a halt. And there's also, I think, an echo of the approach it's taken with Harvard, Columbia, and other elite academic institutions, where it's taken civil rights law, which has generally been employed by the left, with the right being somewhat less enthusiastic, or taking it up on basically the same terms the left does to counter discrimination against underrepresented minorities, blacks, Hispanics, things like that. But now, under the Trump administration, the right has taken up civil rights law to hammer institutions that seem to be discriminating against what are sometimes called overrepresented minorities, Asians, Jews, or against whites. And so it's kind of yielding the logic of the system against the left. And there seems to be something like this going on with the Afrikaner resettlement.
This story reminds me of, do you remember the furore that erupted about 20 years ago in relation to Zimbabwe, where it was like Robert Mugabe is this crazy megalomaniac who is, stealing white people's land, and he's just gone completely nuts. Well, I was an undergraduate student at the time, and I remember I wrote a paper about it. And as I was researching for this paper, I came across like Mugabe was like man of the year in 1980, and he was like this big hero. And then all of a sudden, he's a megalomaniac. So what happened? And it turns out that there were these enormous loans from the overarching financial institutions and development institutions like the IMF, and they recalled the loan. So Mugabe was doing this like very ambitious. Not I'm just describing. I'm not on his side or anything. I'm just saying it was ambitious, rightly or wrongly, sort of land reform. And then they recalled the loans right in the middle of this, and things are like half built, and it's just everything's in disarray. And they start just absolutely fleecing the country. And Mugabe starts giving like the few houses that were actually built to his cronies and this sort of thing. But the real story that was never really told, maybe it was in the intervening years, was these financial institutions in the background that absolutely screwed this country. And so when I heard about this, I thought that sounds a lot like Zimbabwe. And sure enough, yes, the IMF has been giving enormous loans to South Africa and the World Bank, and for like environmental things and to mitigate the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, there's enormous amounts of money, and some of it's for infrastructure, a lot of it's around green transitions, and these come with strings attached, and the strings attached are massive reductions in expenditures, fiscal consolidation measures, and a lot of what the IMF gives in terms of structural adjustments or in terms of the strings attached are all whitewashed, but that's not the right word. I guess they're rainbow washed or race washed. And some of them are things like, you've got to address historical injustice. So I think they're wonderful journalists around the world, and I'm sure that others have noticed this. But I think there's a story to be told here going on in the background about these international organizations that are causing enormous destabilization within countries and infrastructural issues. And then it all kind of and they themselves try to launder this through the language of equality and addressing historical injustice and blah blah blah, and it becomes a story of that crazy South African president and all those crazy South Africans trying to enact some historical retribution here, when what's actually going on is what's always been going on, is just like fleecing African countries.
Earlier this year, South Africa passed a law, and President Cyril Ramaphosa signed a law allowing for forced expropriation, abandoning what had been the previous principle of willing seller, willing buyer, and allowing for uncompensated expropriation of farmland. The bill is supposed to observe certain limits. The expropriation is only supposed to occur when it's done, in the public interest, and when the land isn't being used or improved. So there's a bit of a fudge in the public presentation of it. It's being presented as something akin to American eminent domain, and the bill signed and championed by the ANC has been criticized by the more radical economic freedom fighters, but it's raised very, very serious concerns in Africa among the more liberal elements of the regime. Those who are very concerned about property rights also raise concerns among parties that represent the interests of white South Africans. So that's part of the background to this. And yeah, without getting deep into South African politics, it basically gives the Trump administration a justification for this move, which I think, as Geoff says, really is about victim power. I remember once being at a conference with kind of thinkers, most of whom were on the right, and one of them said, "Look, you can only beat the left if you have victims. You can't beat the left by escaping the logic of victimhood. You have to hold up your own victims. That's the only way you can triumph in this struggle." And I think you're right, Geoff, that some of the administration seem to have taken that lesson to heart.
I would also say it reflects the coalitional influence of essentially, what used to be called the alt-right, but basically the online right, which has been obsessed with the fate of not only, the thing I've found fascinating are these influencers who have speaking of Zimbabwe, who are obsessed with the history of Rhodesia. And it's very fascinating. But I think the important thing about this is that it embodies their vision of what it means to be white. Although I think there is a way which is to be beleaguered, which is to be a victim, which is to be no longer to perceive yourself as the majority population, even if you still are. But to perceive yourself as this kind of embattled minority. And I think you could argue there's a way that this. So I as somebody who usually objects to this, I'm like, yeah, they are really doing. I think this administration really is, in a way, with this more than anything else it's done, is engaged in white identity politics. And it's accepting the terms for that which have been promulgated by this very online sort of faction of the right. And that's I think in part a kind of troll and a sort of an attempt to kind of see how far they can push this sort of politics. But in some ways it's kind of striking in comparison to, say, like the infamous Charlottesville comments that Donald Trump made back then, which were sort of more ambiguous or more, I suppose, even-handed. What people objected to was that they were even-handed, but they weren't exactly a sort of endorsement of the cause. In this case, I think there is actually an overt endorsement of a form of kind of white identity politics that has been extremely popular in these sort of online factions. And that does just suggest to me that, this online right faction, which still sort of lacks power in the sense of being, deeply present in all of these sort of traditional Republican institutions, nonetheless is wielding an influence over this administration and its priorities. And this is probably the clearest indication of that yet.
One thing that's interesting here is that influence, which you correctly identified, Geoff, I think is taking the administration in a direction that really can't be described as isolationist, right? This is reflective of a kind of foreign policy and international politics and orientation toward the world. It affirms America as having a role as a refuge for the poor, tired, and huddled masses. Just that definition has been the image of those masses has been given a very particular definition, and yeah, it's just interesting to see an attempted kind of recasting of American foreign policy and of the kind of messianic aspects of the nation on these right wing lines, which I think is quite distinct from an attempt to say, look, it's not the responsibility of the U.S. to take everybody. Maybe there's some bad stuff happening in South Africa, these very unjust laws, but ultimately they're going to have to fend for themselves. Bad things are happening to people all over the world all the time, and if we take them all in, the country will just be a giant airline terminal with people constantly arriving. That's a very that's a very distinct vision, and it's one that moves like this really cut against. With that, thanks, Geoff. Thanks, Ashley, especially for joining. Feel better soon, Ashley. And listeners, catch us next time. Until then, go to compactmag.com/subscribe.